Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this event organized by IFAD, the Independent Evaluation Office and Management. The topic is evidence-based transformative pathways. As a preamble, climate threats are increasing in frequency and intensity. We note an increase in floods, droughts, cyclones, rising sea levels, changing weather, increased temperature. The consequences disproportionately affect the most marginalized. For instance, the rural agricultural sector and smallholder farmers, the area where IFAD works. Given that we are only 8 years away from the year 2030 and the dire warnings of IPCC's recent report, there is an urgent need to act. Therefore, good is not enough. We need beyond good. We need transformative solutions. Evaluative evidence shows that successful interventions exist locally, yet these are not translating into global successes. Globally, climate response continues to struggle to catch up with the escalating threats. The rationale for the event, ladies and gentlemen, is to find the opportunities and challenges to scale up and to replicate successful solutions, to find a way forward. Our event is as follows. We will start off with an evidence base, 15 minutes. We'll begin by hearing first evidence from evaluators representing a multilateral agency, the IOE, bilateral agency, DEVAL, and the funding mechanism, the GCF. We'll hear from them what works or not and why. The second part, way forward, 10 minutes, we'll hear views on the way forward from the perspectives of international actors, being IFAD, as well as government decision makers. The panel discussion of 15 minutes will follow initial presentations of their positions. We'll have a brief discussion among the panelists, followed by Q&A from participants. The Q&A overall for 45 minutes will follow a TV talk show model to keep this lively. I shall introduce each of the panelists as they are invited to speak. The question to the panelists: evaluative evidence shows that successful climate adaptation interventions exist. Yet, at the global level, climate adaptation response continues to struggle to catch up with the escalating threats. What opportunities and challenges you see in scaling up, replicating successful solution? Each panelist will have 5 minutes. It gives me pleasure to introduce the first panelist. Sven Harten is the Deputy Director at DEVAL, the German Institute for Development Evaluation, and heading the Competence Center for Evaluation Methodologies. He holds a PhD in political science from the LSE and has more than 20 years of experience in designing, implementing, and managing more than 50 evaluations in the field of development cooperation. The main evaluation themes are currently climate change, adaptation, financial cooperation, private sector, as well as evaluation criteria, quality, and standards. Previously, Sven worked at the World Bank, the IFC, the European Commission, as well as for the evaluation consultancy firms. He lived for more than 10 years in developing countries, Africa and Latin America, and has traveled extensively on evaluation missions to these regions. To Sven, as far as finance goes, total climate finance has fallen short of the target. Our question to you: how available finances are allocated is also a critical factor. Are resources reaching the most climate vulnerable countries? Are they targeting the critical NDC priorities? Over to you, Sven.
Thank you, Indran. I'm Sven Harten. I'm speaking on behalf of DEVAL, and just for you to know, we are an independent governmental agency with the mandate to evaluate Germany's bilateral development cooperation. So we look at what works, what doesn't work in terms of the bilateral cooperation of Germany. So whatever I say is about Germany's bilateral cooperation. And there, Indran to your question, so some good news first. So Germany pledged, and we actually found this in the data, to spend 4 billion a year on climate finance. So they are completing this target. They pledged to increase this. Well, we'll see how far that goes. But at least for now, 25% of all German ODA goes into climate related areas. 122 countries are receiving Germany's funding, and main sectors are water, agriculture, and coastal protection. Roughly 30% of Germany's financing on climate has adaptation or mitigation as main objective. So we need to keep that in mind, that 70% has it as secondary objective, which can be good, but it's not the main objective. So when you asked whether the financing is going to the most vulnerable, I've got a nice map for you. We did an allocation analysis looking at where the money goes. I'm not sure. Okay, there it comes. And basically, what we found, looking at 10 years of spending of Germany's bilateral cooperation, is that, first of all, if a country is vulnerable, that increases the likelihood of receiving Germany's bilateral funding. However, what you see here on that map, the more vulnerable a country gets, doesn't mean that they receive more funding. So the first one is sort of, binary, yes or no. Vulnerable countries have a higher likelihood of receiving, but the more vulnerable you get doesn't mean you get more funding. So there we do have an issue. If you look at the map, the blue ones are actually receiving proportionally more funding than what we would expect from their vulnerability level, and the yellow and orange ones are receiving proportionally less. So given that, sub-Saharan Africa is obviously a priority region for Germany's development cooperation, we do have some issues there in terms of where the money goes. If you look at the next slide, this is another important question. Where does the money go? How important are national priorities? So in terms of national priorities, partner orientations, we took the NDCs. I should send up a disclaimer. So the funding numbers we looked at predate, to some extent, the NDCs. The good news is that we do see some good overlap between national priorities as defined in the NDCs. Here we're talking a lot about agriculture and food security. The blue bar that you see there is that the overlap is quite big. However, overall, we should note that 54% of the funds are compliant with national priorities. So just over half. If you look at adaptation as the principal objective, the number rises slightly to 57% being compliant with partner priorities. So, depending on where you sit, the glass is either half full or half empty. But from our side, there's a clear message for the reform of the NDCs. As a bilateral donor, you need to take that more serious. Obviously, there are other rationales for spending money in your countries, but there's room for improvement. I have a next slide. This is also another interesting one. Germany is a big bilateral donor. What we found here is an issue of herding, of donor concentration. The more other donors are present in a country, the more likely it is that Germany is being present. The larger a country is, the more donors are there, the higher the likelihood that Germany is there, which also means that SIDS, for instance, are left out to a good extent from Germany's bilateral cooperation. So, for us being sort of a panel of very different organizations, donor coordination making sure that we go into different countries is crucial. Last but not least, that's more sort of for the later discussion. We looked at what works and what doesn't work. We did a systematic review of available evidence. And fortunately, we see that in the agricultural sector, there's a lot of positive impacts there, what works. So we know what works. Nature-based solutions are one of them. We know where there are gaps in funding, and I'm looking forward to the further discussion to explore how we can improve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sven, for starting off and pointing out also the contradictions between the funding and the needs. I have pleasure now in calling upon our next panelist, Andreas Riemann, who is the head of the Green Climate Fund, acting, the Independent Evaluation Unit. And prior to this, he served as a Principal Evaluation Officer of the IEU, undertaking several evaluations, global evidence reviews, and capacity building work. He has extensive experience in designing impact monitoring systems for large research for development projects, impact evaluations, foresight analysis, and developing alternative evaluation methods. Andreas has previously worked at the Center for International Forestry Research, focusing on M&E and learning capacity. He holds a BA in European Economic Studies and an MSc in Economics from the University of Copenhagen. Andreas, the question to you focuses on evidence-based adaptation solutions. We note that a robust evidence base is critical to address climate adaptation. GCF has analyzed the evidence gaps in addressing climate adaptation, including those in the agricultural sector. The gaps and steps to address these evidence gaps will be discussed. Over to you, Andreas.
Thanks, Indra, and thanks, colleagues, for this lovely introduction. Look, I think, you know, my very brief intervention links very well to what my predecessor here, Sven, has mentioned. And it's about this question of where do we stand in regards to global climate finance? And coming from the Independent Evaluation Unit of the largest climate fund in the world, the questions that we are asking us is, how can we translate our mandate in a way that it really makes sense and goes beyond the usual accountability function? And here we go and saying, okay, first of all, we require evidence and we require trusted evidence that can inform the decision-making at that level. And that decision-making would then in itself inform the policies that enable a fund like ours to invest with high impact. So the IEU here at the GCF is asking itself, okay, what can we do to generate this evidence base? And so we have done throughout the previous 5 years, and we'll continue to do so, we've done global evidence reviews to look at what works, what doesn't, and for whom. And here, the idea has been to really look at this question of how can evidence reviews identify and address the two questions that we have in evaluations. And that is the question of, are we doing things right? So are we efficient? Are we effective? But also, are we doing the right things? And so in that way, GCF is meant to be a learning organization and leapfrogging from some of the mistakes other organizations have done. So we have been using and deploying these global evidence reviews to really look at this in much more detail. And fostering exactly that learning function that we need. And so for those that don't know, evidence reviews and evidence gap maps are basically very pithy type of products that show you in a two-dimensional matrix, sometimes even more dimensional matrices, the intervention as well as the outcome pairs that tell us something about what we know, and also show us the gaps in these areas to tell us we actually don't know how it works. And so we've done one of those for the climate adaptation space, the climate adaptation space being something very, very modern and new, very fashionable at this point. We looked at the evidence that we had from 2015 until now. And we found some very interesting and striking results. I should say here as well that evidence is not always evidence. So it's not always the same. You will have to look at the question of what can the evidence truly bring to you, and what sort of study design do you need to look at to get robustness. But what we've basically found is that most of the evidence lies in very geographical pockets. So we have a lot of evidence in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. When it comes to the sectors, we've got a lot of evidence in agriculture, fishing, and forestry sectors, but we don't know what we're doing and how we're doing it best in for instance, the water sector, and for instance, in areas like Latin America's. So one thing for us now is to go on with this and learn and try to decide, do we go as a fund into a space that has is evidence-based, or do we go into a space where there's scarce evidence, and we will be the thought leader in this space to provide that learning that we need. Thanks, I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for providing that perspective, which is quite critical in terms of the Green Climate Fund. The next panelist will be Nantikasan Nanthi. He's the lead evaluation officer at the IOE of IFAD. He has over 25 years of development and evaluation experience. As the head of corporate level evaluation unit, he has conducted several complex evaluations in IFAD and UNDP, including a recently completed thematic evaluation of IFAD's support to smallholder farmers' adaptation to climate change. In addition to leading global evaluation, he has conducted several country and project evaluations and received his academic training and research experience at Harvard University and MIT. The question to Nanthi is on evidence and pathways to scaling up. We note that no single approach to scaling up exists. Some common elements leading to successful scaling up include commitment and ownership of government to promoting climate adaptation, partnerships and coordination among actors, and favorable conditions to adopt new approaches, be it awareness, community support, knowledge and experience with new technologies and incentives. Nanthi, could you elaborate? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Indran. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to attend this session. Previously, we have heard some constraints like finances from Sven, and we also heard the challenges in terms of finding evidence from Andreas. And I want to highlight some other aspects which could inhibit scaling up, which comes mainly from our evaluations. And as part of our evaluation, we also conducted a review of all the existing literature related to rural agricultural sector and challenges to scaling up. And some of these findings are based on that as well. So as Indran pointed out, first and foremost, there is no single pathway to scaling up. It could be the usual way of integrating them in policies, your experience, or it could be national development programs reflecting your innovations. But also there are other ways of achieving this. For instance, in Bangladesh, we noticed that the government was able to integrate climate resilient considerations in building codes, national building codes, so that structures become climate resilient. There are instances where we saw innovations are integrated into university curriculum, like in Kyrgyzstan. So there are different ways in which we can achieve the scaling up part. This depends on the country context, the agricultural production system, you name the whole range of things will affect how things are going to take place, things are going to get scaled up. One of the critical parts, there are some common elements, obviously, and one of the critical elements everyone knows, and I'm sure James will touch upon those things, will be the commitment of governments. It is commitment, prioritization, their capacities at all levels, not just at the central level, but all the way down to the local levels, how committed they are. Now, so what we find is it is important at all levels, so center and at the local levels. And in some cases, one is there, the other is not there. This is one of the challenges that we face. For instance, in some cases, at the municipal level, there is a thirst for scaling up to replicate to find innovative ideas and propagate. We found that in Bolivia for the talking maps approach to identifying climate vulnerability. So it doesn't have to be at the central level always. It can be at local level as well. We have to seize the opportunity wherever it can be done and use that. And the other part that we want to emphasize, connected to the government efforts as well, it is not just the government, it is also a partnership, a coordination effort that is needed, as Sven also highlighted, coordination among donors, coordination among government units, partnerships with farmer organizations, as well as other actors. All these things need to make sure that innovative approaches are scaled up. And one good example we found that was in Nepal, where the government decided to localize the national adaptation plans. And for this, they used the donor fora to consult with the donors. They looked at the farmer organizations to get their local experience, as well as they coordinated among themselves in order to get the local adaptation plans going. So partnerships and coordination will be the second factor that we need to address and enhance. And the third part that I would like to highlight is nothing would work if there is no demand from the farmers themselves. They need to be aware. They need to be not only aware, but they need to be familiar with the technical know-hows and the technologies of adapting. So even if they have these technical know-hows, it is not enough because they are taking a risk. They are trying to change the behavior. There have to be some initial conditions that allow them to take those risks, like being financially initial assets, quality of the initial assets are sufficient for them to take a risk. They should have a network of community support to be able to take the risk. So there are multiple layers that are there, which we find are necessary for farmers to change their behavior. One of the literature survey finds that one of the most effective ways in which farmers can switch or will switch will be through peer-to-peer learning, like in farmer field schools. So there are different ways in which you have to push on the one hand the work of government and the partners around. At the same time, we are in need of promoting at the farm level demand, farm and community level, the demand for changing their behavior to adapt to climate change. So I will stop here and we can have further elaboration of this during question and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nanti. It gives me pleasure to call upon the fourth panelist, and in his role at IFAD, Mr. Donald Brown is responsible for developing and managing the operations that the fund supports through its loans and grants, which amounts to approximately $8 billion of IFAD financing. In addition, he oversees the program of work of the department, which is undertaken by 5 regional divisions spread across 15 country hubs and 40 country offices, and the Operational Policy and Results Division. To Mr. Brown, if you could elaborate, sir, what international development actors are doing to help the marginalized smallholder farmers meet the escalating climate threats through IFAD example, and what are the challenges and opportunities for scaling up? Mr. Brown.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. Let me just start by saying it's music to my ears to hear Andreas saying that we need to learn the lessons. I think for too long as a user of evaluations, they've been very focused on accountability, and really it's about lesson learning. I mean, there is an accountability element, and we're working very closely with our own independent evaluation unit in IFAD to do that, because if we're not learning, we're not going to be able to meet these challenges. So maybe just briefly in terms of IFAD, and for those of you that don't know IFAD, what do we do, particularly on climate change? So we work with our partners in building resilient food systems and mainstreaming climate change adaptation through investing directly with smallholders and rural communities. So we get the money down to the very bottom. And based on our latest corporate impact assessments, smallholder farmers who have received our support are about 13% more resilient than their counterparts. And that actually represents about 26 million people at the moment. So how do we do that? As I say, we put dedicated resources right down to where they count with the most vulnerable. And it's not just our core resources, as Indran said, of the 8 billion loans and grants, but actually as important is the blending of those resources and ensuring that we mix those with supplementary resources. In this case, we have the largest global smallholder adaptation funding program, ASAP. And the blending is really important because the grant elements allow us to experiment, to innovate, to investigate, to produce the evidence we've been talking about, and then use our larger portfolio to scale up. So over the last 3 years, 35% of our core resources have gone to primarily adaptation. In the next 3 years, it'll be 40%. And what are some of the things that we do with these? We obviously support access to knowledge. And really important in that aspect is investing in and using the knowledge of local communities. Secondly, putting communities at the center of natural resource management. You know, we have to identify adapted solutions with communities and that are owned by communities. So for example, in Mali, we supported communities to design their own adaptation plans and scale them up into national development practices. We particularly invest in small-scale rural infrastructure for smallholders, and especially in water infrastructure, irrigation, micro-irrigation. But it's not just about the hard infrastructure, it's also about investing in the capacity of communities to understand, to manage these effectively. And then obviously we do a lot on diversification of farming systems to ensure that we have different crops, climate resistant crops, etc. And of course, a key to this is good use of data, collecting data and evidence and adjusting and making real-time decisions. So in other words, adaptive management. So in terms of scaling up, I see 5 main challenges. Firstly, the experience, the knowledge, the evidence is often very context specific. So as we heard, ensuring that we've got real evidence that covers the globe, not just sub-Saharan Africa. You can't design a response for Latin America based on what we know about the Sahel. So it's very specific. Secondly, the real challenge is limited availability of climate finance. We know that just too little is going to adaptation. 2% of climate finance in 2017-18 went to smallholder farmers, those that are most affected and produce 30% of the world's food. So we need much more finance. We also need much more awareness in the international community, and particularly with the national governments we work with, about adaptation, about climate, and that these are turned into medium and long-term plans and investments with the governments. You know, governments are very reluctant, for example, to take loans for that adaptation. So we need to really get this as mainstream. And we need to see adaptation as a core part of development policy. So in terms of the opportunities, it's the reverse really, mobilize additional financing, particularly for adaptation, absolutely key. Without that, it won't happen. And it has to be a blend. It has to have, as I say, that grant resource for innovation and experimentation. We need much stronger partnerships. So in IFAD, for example, we're working together with the Green Climate Fund, Jeff and the Adaptation Fund to raise another 1 to 2 billion over the next 3 years for us to be able to invest in adaptation, but also with others like EIB. We need to institutionalize adaptation practices in IFAD, but with others. So, you know, adaptation is not an add-on, it's central. And farmers' priorities must take precedence. And last, we need to bring the private sector into this picture. It's not just about the public investments, it's also about working with the private sector. And I'll stop there, thank you.
Thank you very much, Donald, for those practical examples in terms of what IFAD is doing on the ground. I now will move to the next perspective. The panelists will provide a government civil society perspective and address the following challenges: limited awareness of the importance of climate adaptation to sustainable development among decision makers, the availability of climate finance for the $100 billion promised, a fraction has been made available, and mutually reinforcing negative impacts of demographic change and climate change. The panelists would be James Gassana, a Swiss independent evaluator for UN agencies, IFAD, FAO, and UNDP, and the International Tropical Timber Organization. He has extensive field and decision-making level experience in planning and implementation of natural resource management and rural development. Before his retirement and turning to evaluation, he worked for 20 years for the Swiss Foundation for Development and International Cooperation as senior advisor in resource governance, focusing on land, forests, and biodiversity. He is also author and contributor to books on aspects linking ecology and the political history of his mother country, Rwanda. I have pleasure in welcoming James to provide an perspective.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for your presence. Climate change will be a significant impediment to sustainable development in developing countries, particularly in Africa. We already witnessed an array of negative impacts on the rural poor, which include increased risks of flooding for many communities due to heavier rainfall and increased number of victims, reduced crop yields, decreased water availability in drylands, increased exposure to vector-borne diseases such as malaria, and low-cost emergencies such as we have had recently the case in East Africa and the Horn of Africa, just to mention a few. Today, governments already face many challenges on mainstreaming adaptation strategies into national development programs and in implementing them. I will focus only on 3 of those challenges. One, raising the awareness on the urgency of strengthening effective adaptation and mitigation actions. The second, the insufficient resources for climate finance. And third, strengthening the partnership between state and the rural people to address the impacts of the tandem climate change and demographic change. Raising awareness is an important challenge. Adequate awareness of the stakeholders, including the government, private sector, academia, NGOs, and other relevant groups is the precondition to recognizing adaptation needs and the urgency to increase resilience in planning climate change responses. Both the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Climate Change Agreement recognize the importance of education and public awareness in the drive towards sustainable development. Governments face the challenge of raising the awareness of decision makers and society to the urgency to adapt and manage expected climate change. However, where outreach programs exist, such as in national plans, national adaptation plans, implementation at the subnational levels, like provincial level, district level, and the lower level, is difficult due to lack of resources to take extension messages to the people who are on grassroots level. There is an important challenge of climate finance. To meet this challenge of awareness raising and other challenges, governments must mobilize resources from public and private climate sources, both domestic and international, to implement their national adaptation plans and other climate-related strategies and develop appropriate capacities. Resources for implementing comprehensive programs to address climate change impacts have been inadequate. In most countries, public funds are insufficient to finance climate, given the other competing needs for scarce resources, and they must rely heavily on external funding. However, while external funding has increased in recent years, it is not enough. At the 15th Conference of Parties, COP15, in Copenhagen in 2009, developed countries committed to the goal of mobilizing $100 billion per year by 2020 for climate action in developing countries. Although climate finance for developing countries has risen to $78.9 billion in 2018, it was estimated that it was still 20 billion short of the 2020 goal of mobilizing 100 billion recommended by COP15. Ladies and gentlemen, there is an important challenge of addressing the impacts of the tandem climate change and demographic change. For example, the population of Africa, which is today 1.38 billion, of whom half are less than 25 years old, is expected to reach 1.5 billion in 2030, in just a few years. This change will increase competition for scarce agricultural and pastoral land and water resources. The impacts of climate change in many countries of the continent are taking place in a tandem with those of demographic change and changes in population composition in developing countries, particularly in Africa. Demographic changes are exacerbating the impact of climate change on the vulnerability of the rural poor. For example, in parts of the Sahel, the Horn of Africa and Central Africa, rapid population growth affects communities' resilience and ability to adapt to climate change. There is a partnership, what I call a partnership, between population growth, climate change, and the related natural resource degradation to exacerbate the vulnerability of rural populations. There is a challenge for governments to match this vicious partnership with a strong climate-proof partnership between the state and the rural people through their grassroots organizations and stakeholders, including civil society organizations and the private sector. Nothing short of such a partnership can allow developing countries to deliver transformative change in addressing the impacts of climate change. And in more precise terms, it would be a new climate-proof rural social contract between the states and the rural people, which simply means that it is important to answer the question, what does the state and the rural producers owe to each other? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jane, for providing the perspective from government and civil society and the questions that relate at that level. Ladies and gentlemen, we move on to the next section where I will pose a provocative question to members of the panel for them to respond, and thereafter we'll have them engage with each other before we open to the audience. The question for the panelists: the current development approaches often come at the expense of ecosystems and environmental sustainability. Unfortunately, climate adaptation responses appear no different. Do you agree? If so, what do available evidence suggest as pathways forward in terms of advocacy, awareness raising, agro-technology, policy framework, and climate finances? I will start with Sven on your response to this question. Also, feel free to merge the earlier presentation you made in terms of the question from your agency. Sven.
Thank you, Indran. So guys, let's make this interesting. Indran, I highly respect you and I rarely disagree with you, but on that question, no. They are genuine adaptation interventions which are different. Let's be clear. I don't think we should all throw it into one bowl and mix it. However, the problem is that what I said in the beginning, at least for bilateral donors, the reporting system is that you have main objectives of interventions and secondary. So the main objectives in adaptation, you know, that it's only a fraction. There we get genuine good adaptation interventions. Some of them really work. As Dan said, for instance, irrigation, smallholder infrastructure. We did a geospatial impact assessment looking at irrigation projects in Mali over 10 years. We found really surprising good results, encouraging results, not only on agricultural production, but also on women's health, on child nutrition, and even on conflict. So there is good stuff happening out there. However, what do we do with the large chunk, which is the majority, at least for bilateral donors, of secondary objectives? You know, a project can have 6, 7 secondary objectives, and one is sort of ticking the box as adaptation. So we need to measure this better. We need to get serious about sort of how we use the Rio markers, how we use the creditor reporting system, the CRS data from the OECD, and sort of, you know, make sure that we look at the data the right way. And there also, you know, in terms of learning, I think Dan also mentioned that we need to get better in having the context-specific information. And there, perhaps it's strange as a bilateral donor to really emphasize this, but we need to get better in sharing the evidence. We need to get better in doing joint evaluations. There are too few joint evaluations out there. Every donor, every agency is the bulk of the stuff they're doing alone. We need to stop that. We need to work together as evaluators and to create that evidence, because even as a big bilateral donor, you know, we can't generate the evidence that is needed by operations for the specific context. And for instance, what I said in the beginning, you know, we looked at Germany's evidence, and we found very little actually on adaptation, and we did a systematic review, and there we found the good positive impacts. So we need to work strongly together here. And perhaps another point related to what James has been saying, taking local priorities more into account and getting away from national measurements. You know, vulnerability, so many things are defined on a national level. We heard from Dan, from James, from other colleagues here that local knowledge is so important, and we need to start measuring, for instance, vulnerability also on a subnational level. I think yeah, let me stop by saying, we know what is working. Nature-based solutions is one of them. In the water sector, for instance, also nature-based infrastructure, small-scale infrastructure, irrigation. There's a couple of good things out there, but we need to get better data on the reporting side, and we need to work strongly and better together as the evaluator to generate the evidence, what works and what doesn't. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sven. Came back passionately there. That's important. I would now ask Andreas to come in on the same provocative question. Your take.
Thank you, Indra. Thank you. Look, without saying that we're here sitting in the same corners, I very much agree with Sven on some of these points. I want to make three pleas when thinking about this question about environmental sustainability and where we stand at the moment. From our perspective, and again, I'm speaking about the perspective of the evaluators here at the GCF, we are very much in agreement here that we are all experiencing the realities of climate change now. So we are starting to see a convergence from the climate as well as from the human activities. So we basically have two different systems that are now starting to interact. And these systems are very, very complex and form a new complex system. So we here at the IU, we thought about this in a way to say, we have the ingredients in front of us. We know the different systems, but the emergence of these new systems requires us to think more in the question of complexity and the complex thinking. So in that way, we say we need to learn, and we must learn to explain, to predict, and to act within such a new complex system. And that is very much linked to what Sven said when we look at the evidence that we've got, and I'm referring again to the evidence gap map that I was presenting earlier. What we found in adaptation is that we have very little evidence in areas that are very, very pertinent to adaptation interventions. And beyond water, there's also this question of enabling environments, institutional environments. So the policy area. And here we do not know how to affect policy areas in the right way and policies in the right way that it would help to do our interventions in the adaptation space. So it's very much against again that question that to define the different concepts in the space of policy, in the space on institutional enabling environments. And here we ought to think about what is traditional knowledge, what does it mean, how do we address it, what is the concept of innovation, how do we tackle innovation in the adaptation space. We found from our evaluation, it's not so much about the technology, so about what we call the hardware innovations. It's far more about the software innovations where we need to look and act on behavioral matters as well as institutional matters. And lastly, what we also found is it's also a question of high transaction costs. And that goes very much to what Donna said as well as Sven. At the end of the day, we have a lot of finance that could be unleashed and could come to the ground. But the question then is, we're struggling with high transaction costs and high coordination costs on the ground. And here we need to improve and we need to be better to enable those stakeholders on the ground to effectively use that other complex system of finance, of climate finance. Thanks, I stop here.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Since we are still on the evaluation element and talking about evidence and the lack of evidence, I'm going to ask Nanthi to come in also in the evaluation perspective on evidence. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. I must say, I must respectfully disagree with Sven and agree with the question posed, the proposition posed by Indran. Perhaps it is because we interpret the question differently. Let me rephrase this. Any development intervention, whatever the objectives are, there could be unintended consequences on the environment. That is our concern. As the Secretary General pointed out, we are treating nature as a toilet. Is our development intervention doing that or not is the question. It is a common perception that if we are dealing with climate and climate adaptation, then we are somehow or other exempt from this consideration. What we saw in our evaluation was quite the contrary. We may be very good at adapting in the short term to a particular climate threat. For instance, we may do a conservation agriculture in a zone which is drought prone, wind erosion, poor soil health. Conservation agriculture makes perfect sense. Yet we would put chemical fertilizers and use heavy machineries along with that adaptation process. That is when we hit the ecosystems hard. So that is what we have to worry about, whether we are looking at all dimensions. Here I agree with Andreas, that is a complex system. We have to look at biodiversity. We have to look at the quality of air, quality of water, land use. All those things have to be simultaneously considered. And the point is, common belief is it is a zero-sum game. Either you do development anthropocentric way. That's the way in which you can maximize the livelihood of farmers. Any other consideration is going to take away from these farmers' livelihoods. There are situations like that, we don't deny that, but we don't explore sufficiently the non-zero-sum game efforts, where win-win solutions can be possible. Are we simultaneously looking at environmentally sustainable and economically viable interventions in dealing with climate adaptation? That is the question we were asking, and we found that in majority of the cases, it is not the case when we looked at the evaluation. There are, part of the problem is it is so complex, and we may not have the capacity or know-how to do that. but the effort has to start. The good news is we have seen excellent projects which are looking at not only do no harm, but also restore the damaged environment. And I can give you an example of the project in Brazil, Northeast Brazil, that the government of Brazil, GCF, Andrea's coming from that, and IFAD jointly developed. It is planting resilience in rural communities in Northeast Brazil. It's a $200 million project. It's covering 2 million farms, and it is involving 6.5 million people who are working in those farms. What is the problem? The problem is, since 1980, the region has been experiencing intensifying droughts. As a result of that, the groundwater has become saline and brackish. So 75% of the households which rely on wells have this problem. So the project's aim is not only to make sure that farmers get their income and all those things, but also to restore and protect the groundwater reserves. So this they do through nature-based solutions. I fully agree with Sven on that. Nature-based solutions, invariably we find that successful solutions are always nature-based, and it also happens to be at the landscape level, obviously, because it's a large region. And it also involves community participation, close community participation, and their inputs, local knowledge, and all those things need to come into play. With that, they are trying to develop systems, agro-technology, and so on and so forth to address the situation. The important part, here is where the important part comes. Restoration is not a short-term effort. It's going to take a while. Until then, what do the farmers do? Do they continue to draw from these reserves and deplete it further? No, the project produces a solution for that. In the interim, it is protecting the farmers from drawing from these reserves and provide alternative sources. That requires resources. So restoration doesn't come free. It requires climate financing, and climate financing agencies should be cognizant of the fact that restoration takes time and compensation to make sure that the damage is undone. So this is the part that I think we would like to emphasize, that more awareness has to be there, more methods to analyze these complex systems, and I fully agree with Sven and Andreas, evidence have to be generated. We need to build on knowledge how to do this, guidance, evidence to see what kind of things would work and what kind of things will not work, and recognize the complexity and make sure that we incorporate that in all designs, regardless of what they are, whether it could be a poverty reduction strategy or an agricultural sector strategy. We need to focus on what could be the unintended consequences on ecosystems at large. Over.
Thank you very much, Nanti. I'm going to hold with James because I see questions that have come through pertaining to government, but I'll hand over to Donald now with the extensive field experience to respond to the discussions that have come through on the floor.
Good. So maybe I'll just maybe I'll stay agnostic at the moment for that bit of the question, apart from to say that it's good to see evaluators argue. I think, as Sven says, there is some really good examples of what works. To me, there's two things here, though, is how do you build on them and how do you take them to scale? But secondly, I think sometimes we get too fixated with quantitative evidence and not enough on qualitative evidence, or at least not valuing it properly. And maybe in that context, I think it's really important that we also ensure we're valuing the evidence that comes from communities themselves, and that we place more emphasis on indigenous knowledge, on livelihoods, and particularly rural livelihoods are very complex. They're not binary decision making. It's not always just about the economic benefits. It's very much about some of the social, community, and other benefits. So I don't think we put enough emphasis on that. So we need to put rural people at the center of building the evidence, designing projects, and evaluating them. And I think we overlook that a lot because it's more difficult, it's more complex, it's not quite so easy to measure. So that's one reason, for example, in IFAD, we work very closely. We host the Indigenous Peoples Forum, the farmer organizations, but also the International Land Coalition. How do we really get their voices into this process, including an evaluation? I think the other thing is we need to be prepared to take risks. Too often, maybe we try and play too safe because we want that evidence and we want it to be really, really robust and foolproof. And part of this is going to be also about building the capacity that we need there to collect that evidence. So, I think there's some of the things. And then my last point is about, it's not only about documenting that evidence, but it's bringing it into a form that's accessible for policymakers, for operational people, but including for the communities themselves. I mean, nature-based solutions, biodiversity, these things are not new. Rural communities have been practicing them for centuries. In many ways, we've just discovered them. And that's why we have to go back to putting them at the center of collecting evidence and evaluating things.
Thank you very much, Donald. Questions are now coming in from the audience, and I'll hand over to James. And there is a specific question also that has come through, is how receptive are governments to evidence-based transformative pathways? Are some countries more receptive than others, given your experience, James?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. I think you find all kinds of situations when you compare how governments are responsive to the need of transformative changes. We have seen really governments which are really far ahead in integrating sustainability and addressing climate change in the national plans. And if I take the case of Africa, if you take a country like Ethiopia, on national planning, there is hardly anything better than one can imagine as far as how one would like to see that aspect integrated. But if you consider, in general, many other countries, I think there is very much a number of them lagging behind because of other focuses. Consider now the region in the Sahel, countries, the so-called G5, G6 countries, where now they are faced with a lot of problems that focusing on this aspect becomes second or third or fourth issue. The number one being insecurity, and the more they are entangled in insecurity problems, the less focus they put on this aspect. So that's an extreme. We have another positive extreme. And in between, you find all kinds of situations. And of course, the problem is that, as it was mentioned, there is no scaling up of good experiences that where positive results have shown that a step further can be made. So I think, unfortunately, I think there is a wide diversity of situations which makes it really important, again, to raise awareness in most of those countries where they are still lagging behind. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. The questions have come in already, and they've been quite specific. There's one to Andrea. How can we bring down the transaction cost you spoke about? Over.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. Look, as an evaluator, I would always limit myself in saying we look at what we know, what works and what doesn't, but we don't necessarily do the strategy part that would have to come after. But and that said, if you think about things that have come from the grounds through the evaluations and through the interviews that we've had in the countries, the country missions have been very clear that the issue on transaction costs is twofold. One, we have this concept of country ownership at the GCF that we're still battling with, and that is that projects should truly be owned by the country. But how are we defining what that means? What is the country? Is it the government? Is it a particular ministry? And I believe James has also alluded to this in his statement to say that, you know, a country has various interests. Ministries have various interests. That is also something to consider and to look at and enable enable climate management on the ground that is inclusive to all that are relevant, the relevant stakeholders in the country. So I'd say it's about creating this integrative, the integrated approach, creating platforms of interactions. But the second part, and this is my last point on this, would then be also to say, and that's come also from Sven and from others, is this question of how are we acting on evidences that we find? How are we guaranteeing knowledge generation and knowledge sharing that is real time and that is targeted right as we find it? And here, the IEU is trying this with a new program that we call a learning-oriented real-time impact assessment. And that is basically work where we go with projects of the GCF to integrate real-time monitoring systems that allow to feedback and create that opportunity for adaptive management right away in climate projects. And those things are important to climate projects in particular, as climate is changing constantly and continuously, and projects need to adapt and need to be able to adapt rapidly. So that's the 2 points I would make on that. Thanks.
No, thank you very much. Useful points, adaptive management, feedback, and which is a question that I'm also going to pose to Donald. Do you believe that the evaluative evidence is of quality and fast enough for management to make decisions? But before coming to that, I'm going to go over to Sven, because you've also provoked a question. And the question is, what countries would you predict follow Germany's lead in scaling up funding? That's highly sensitive. And are there any indicators that suggest others may look at SIDs? You point to the question of the inequity. Could you come through? Thank you.
Yes. So the first one, obviously, I can't answer. I'm not a politician. I'm not even sitting in the ministry. But first of all, I would say I hope that the announcement that Chancellor Merkel did this summer of scaling up to 6 billion, that this will be followed up by the new government. Well, obviously it's shaping, well, obviously I don't know, but it's shaping up to be a coalition that has some the Green Party in it. So I think we do have some hopes that it will be followed through. But rather than sort of looking at other countries, I would rather look at my own and first of all, you know, thinking about scaling up our own ambitions. But then, you know, 6 billion is a nice number. But as I said repeatedly, you know, a majority of those 6 billion need to go into projects, interventions that have adaptation or mitigation as primary objective. You know, in other contexts, you know, we talk about greenwashing and so on, but I think we need to get our numbers straight here, and you know, the 6 billion, a majority at least of the 6 billion, and that would be a big increase, should be into the KLA2 or KLM2 markers, so with the priority objectives. So I think they're looking just at Germany. We want to support the ministry to scale up the ambition there. Let me just stop there.
Good, thank you very much. I'll hand over to Donald on the question on real-time evidence, adaptation, and responsiveness in terms of changing environment. You've also brought in the issue of community voice, and to what extent do we give adequate attention to the perspectives from the ground, also noting the challenges in collecting citizen voices, which is also the most complex. Donald.
Thanks, Indran. So I think we're getting better at this. As I said at the beginning, I think moving from an accountability lens to a learning lens really helps. And part of that learning must mean, you know, don't let perfect be the sort of hostage of the good. So getting evaluations and getting the evidence out quickly allows us to respond to it and allows us to adapt. And I think that's really important. In the past, we've been quite slow. We've been looking at the sort of journal level evaluations for publication, and they come too slow to really learn from them and adapt. I think the second point, though, is that, as we said earlier on, much of the successful interventions for adaptation are context specific. So I think we have to avoid generalizations. Very often I see a set of recommendations which are quite general, and therefore you couldn't really disagree with them, but they don't necessarily help you. So I think, being quite specific and being clear, what's kind of specific to that context versus what's a more general observation on that side of things. I think probably the last thing is to, again, as I say, follow. It's not only production of evidence, it's ensuring that that evidence is used. I was once told that we're very good at identifying lessons. We're not very good at learning lessons. And the difference there is we've got lots and lots of evidence out there, but much of it doesn't really get used because we don't act on it. And so the key thing we have to do is ensure that what evidence comes out is acted upon. So you need to follow that through, not feel the job's done because evidence is produced. Thank you.
Thank you, Donald. James, I'm going to come over to you. You've seen in your career a lot of production of evidence, but you've also seen how governments absorb it. And there's a discrepancy. In a very candid way, can you comment on that?
Yes.
The use of evaluative evidence, as pointed out by the colleagues, the evaluators and also management.
Yes. Well, I think the problem in the government in some countries is that sometimes people are too sure of their evidence, and they can think that they have evidence to solve everything in their area. And the problem you find, whether you are at government level or lower level, is this sectoral thinking. Very good people, if they think sectorally, even if you have good evidence applied sectorally, it doesn't solve problems. And that's what I have personally found. And in fact, the first thing I did when I was in the government was to explain to the government what food security is, because they didn't know it, and what it means for the country, that it is not only agricultural production, but it is also other areas of the economic sector. In fact, I went even further to tell them that I would agree that they reduce my budget and they finance micro industries and other sectors, because I was finding that agriculture alone, as they were planning it, cannot address development problems of the country if we don't have solutions for the young people who are 55, 60% of the population, and I could not have land-based solutions for the youth. So the first thing is that government itself really is educated on what is sustainability, what is climate change adaptation, what is food security, and if it is not, whatever good solutions there is, they cannot really move further. And the question I have also found is those who make a step forward, this notion of sustainability. When we talk about sustainable natural systems, that's good, but we have to understand the interconnections between sustainabilities. We cannot have sustainable natural systems if we don't have sustainable communities. And the communities in rural areas and some densely populated countries are just exploding. And whatever you talk good on sustainable ecosystems, if we don't have sustainable communities, it will not work. And the governments have got to be aware of that interconnection of these two sustainabilities, human systems and ecosystems.
Thank you very much, James. The word that's coming through, two themes I'd like to explore on is, one is sustainability, because we have criteria to measure it, and it's a criteria we always get challenged on because we generally measure it adversely, saying it's not sustainable because our criteria is designed in that way. We spent many years in the evaluation community getting to that, and we still haven't resolved the matter. The second issue that has been brought up is the specificity of recommendations. Generalized or specific, to what point do we get too detailed? To what point we're on the general level? So I'm going to ask, starting with Nanthi, a quick reaction, and then move over to our evaluation colleagues on this.
Thank you. Two questions you asked. One is about sustainability, and the other is about relevance of recommendations, utility and relevance of recommendations. Sustainability has two parts. It's durable, whether the benefits will continue and so on. The other is environmental sustainability, and we are focusing on the environmental sustainability part. And to me, one of the things that evaluations can learn from management is the requirement to have environmental impact assessment in their interventions. We don't have any such thing equivalent of that in evaluations as a dedicated aspect of evaluation, assessing the impact, which is what translates to the transaction cost that was raised, and Sven was pointing out as well. The point is that we need to have more practice doing this. Evaluators have to do more practice doing this complex analysis, which itself could be done obviously for only major evaluations, where we focus on the different dimensions of ecosystems, biodiversity to land use and water quality and so on and so forth, and how unintended consequences or intended consequences are accruing to the ecosystem. This is a complex analysis. We need to have more practice. We need to have guidance. Guidance comes through practice and results. So we can follow from the environmental impact assessment what they do in a formative stage, whether we can do at a summative stage. So that is one aspect that I would propose. Environmental sustainability is critical. We are 8 years away from 2030. We are nowhere close to achieving those goals in terms of climate goals. So it is important that we focus on that. As for the recommendations, again, we have a toolbox. There are project level evaluations, and then there are thematic level evaluation. There are evaluations that could have rapid assessments, evaluations that could assess over 10-year period of time. They all have different purposes. If you want a specific understanding of a particular climate adaptation project, then we would, of course, want to go either real time or go into that in a project level during the project to analyze the response. That would then give concrete recommendations about what should have been done differently or what could be done now in order to improve the project. Whereas if we have to understand how we are developing interventions and whether we should do anything differently when we develop our programming, that would require a different instruments. And there we'll have general recommendations to mostly addressing what kind of procedures you should take, what kind of checks that you would make in designing a particular. For instance, you would want to know what would ensure that local knowledge is incorporated into this, what kind of steps you would have in your design that would guarantee local knowledge is in. This should be part of your design, and that could be a general, regardless of the specificity of the project. If you don't consult the locals, you are not going to get anywhere. So that part has to be the job of a macro level, a corporate level evaluation, which will come and tell you, oh, these steps have to be done in order for projects to function as they are intended to. I'll stop here. Over.
Thank you, Nanthi. I'm now going to hand over to Sven. From the experience of Deval and the long German experience around criteria, or should I say the long debates, remains unresolved. Can you come in on that point of, also brought up by Donald, the learning and accountability, can they coexist, and how does process make it happen?
Okay, so perhaps first a point on criteria and on sustainability in particular. 2018, we completed an evaluation looking at sustainability in German development cooperation. We found 43 different definitions in evaluations of sustainability. and that's only an analysis of 500 reports. So every every 10th report more or less came up with a new definition. So then came a reform first in the German system and then also in the OECD DAC EvalNet. So now we have the new OECD DAC evaluation criteria that my colleagues here know. I think there we do have a framework that we can work with on sustainability and on others. Coherence is a very interesting one as well. But that debate won't be over, I think. In terms of process and recommendations, you know, as an evaluator, I'm often critical about sort of Germany and here I think we do have a good practice example because what the evaluation function in Germany used to be part within the Ministry of Development Cooperation. 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago, DEVAL was established as an independent government agency with the mandate to evaluate. And we have a process with reference groups where we invite all stakeholders. And at the end, all of our reports, they're published. They go directly to the deputy minister, and they go directly to Parliament simultaneously. I should also mention. So in terms of transparency, I think that works relatively well. Now the upshot, of course, is such a transparent and inclusive process takes a lot of time. And our evaluations are unfortunately not known to be sort of the fastest in the world. So for us, you know, good process being Germans, I think we're really strong on a good process, but we're not agile. So for us, the challenge is really how to square good quality evaluations, a fair process, quality recommendations and publications of all the results with adaptive management, with agility. So I think there it's sort of a difficult balance for evaluators, as Andreas said, you know, and I really admire your example, you know, in climate change and in adaptation, you need to have also quick evidence. So there I'm looking to learn from our colleagues.
Thank you very much. Over to Andrea with the GCF experience and the fact that you all have been quite innovative in mapping out evidence, and you all have been looking at methodologies very, very deeply. What can we learn to become, as evaluation community, production of evidence faster, quicker, but also credible?
Yeah. Thanks, Indran. Thank you. Look, it's a very interesting discussion to think about the sustainability criteria and what's linked to this. And I would have exactly used that as an example to highlight the era we're in now with COVID and with all the struggles that we've experienced through the last couple of years in evaluations. So one thing that has been very difficult for us as evaluators is to ground truth evaluations. And what I mean by that is to be able to go to the countries and speak to the stakeholders, and not only the stakeholders that are implementing the projects, but are there as watchdogs, as potential beneficiaries, as others that may profit from any spillover effects. It is really important to go and be able to see and experience and understand the context a project may be in. And in that perspective, I think we were not there yet in terms of methodologies to completely replace virtual country missions, in-person country missions. Virtual country missions can only be done so well as a certain replacement for short term, but it can't replace them in the long term. What we found, however, is that we can use other methods. So, and I've been speaking about complexity, so I will leave that aside. We have tried to bring about a mapping tool to look at complexity and what it means and how we can use it in evaluations. We're now looking at the question of big data and how we can perhaps look at machine learning and opportunities for machine learning and big data that's there. But then most importantly, we also look at the question of climate and what sort of climate information we can rely on here, GIS, so geospatial information, is key and can provide a very interesting and deep resource for additional knowledge on how a project or how a program may relate to the context in the country, in the region, or even in the village. So that's something that we find quite relevant. And lastly, just to say as well, when we look at the criteria as we have them in sustainability, certainly also talks about this question of the environmental sustainability, so the question of co-benefits. And this is how we describe it at the GCF. For us, sustainability is one, the question of durability, but it's also the question of how to create co-benefits that go beyond the climate smart development pathways that we want to establish. And what we find here is that the criteria, the evaluation criteria is helpful, but it's not enough. We have gone beyond the OECD DAC criteria at the IEU. We've defined them in our newly approved board-approved policy. We've used those criteria since 2017, and they included criteria such as gender to really truly think about inclusiveness, as well as questions of unintended positive as well as negative effects that we can't simply capture in impacts and in sustainability. So I think there is this question of what do we need to do in climate evaluations to truly have criteria that are reasonable and meaningful, as well as how can we use new methods such as GIS to truly tell a story about what is happening on the ground and how we can learn. I'll keep it at that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Extremely rich discussion. We're coming to closure. I have a question that's come online, and I'm just going to read it, not for response. Oliver Camp says, one of the many great injustices is that we expect smallholder farmers to sustainably produce nutritious food for almost 8 billion people and growing, but they themselves rarely consume this. Instead, it's exported. And how can we promote production for local consumption in the countries and communities where nutritious foods are grown? Something to think about. We've seen field experience on that. So with the 4 minutes, I'm going to ask for a 45-second quick input from the colleagues, starting off with Nanti, in terms of key points that you think is important on the relationship between evidence and action.
It is important, as we all recognize, that there are different spectrum in which, as James pointed out, governments have the capacities, priorities, multiple priorities that are there, including climate. So within this context of multiple priorities and pressures that the government faces, how do we, within that context, how do we encourage and advocate for smallholder agriculture or agriculture in general, particularly in making sure that solutions that are win-win, not only they provide food for the farmers, but also make sure that the ecosystems are not damaged, to persuade the governments to pursue those things with resources, mobilizing climate finances in order for them to do that. That is a critical part. Some countries, as pointed out, already are there. They have climate as their national priority, like Bangladesh. Some countries, it will be a hard task for them to, amidst the internal strife and so on, to dedicate resources and attention to climate. So we need to be tailor-making our approaches to each country to make sure that they have the awareness, resources, and wherewithal to find win-win solutions, which ultimately is an absolute must if we have to meet the 2030 goals. Over.
Thank you, Nanti. James, over to you.
Thank you. I think it is a fundamental question, that one, but also a question which shows that the reflection should even be widened. The producers who can produce that nutritious food, I think they are a part of the answer, but they are also an illustration of the other part of the problem, that there are people who are supposed to be producers, but who are not producing. They can neither produce nor consume, either because they don't have enough production base, have tiny lands, and they don't have enough resources for purchasing the good food produced by others. And the problem is that that group, the trend is to have it wider particularly in certain highly densely populated rural areas. So I would rather put the question that wider perspective, where we are having now an illustration of inequalities even within the poor group, even within the rural area. So that rather another question to just show that it is a very important question, but that has to be responded by more equitable life in rural areas, not focusing only on those who have missed produce, but those who have nothing to lose and nothing to win when we consider the win-win solution.
Thank you, James. Yeah. Donald.
Thanks, Indra. Maybe 3 points on evidence and action. The first one is is that we all need to take responsibility. They're not two separate issues. You don't produce evidence but take no responsibility for action. So we need the right evidence and we need it from a range of perspectives. And then we need the right sort of products and recommendations. So I would challenge evaluators that you need to think about what would you do with this, because if we're really trying to evaluate, we want change. So give us the right evidence, but the right recommendations that allow us to change and take responsibility to make sure we're using it. So we've got the right products communicated in the right sort of way that allow these things to get there and that they're targeted properly. So I think that's there. And then the last point, of course, is you can have evidence, but for real action, we need the money to flow. So part of that is actually getting the resources through for the action.
Good. Thank you very much. I see I'm being shown that we're coming to the closure, and we've had very rich inputs that have come through. To thank the audience for the various questions and your participation. This has been rich on multiple levels, methodology being critical, but also the key question is evaluation for what? And evaluation is for change, for use. So let us not forget about that. It's not just the production of information for some academic pursuit. It's important that it is rigorous, but it's also important that it gets used and brings about the dialogue and the conversations. So with that, thank you very much for your participation. It's been a rich session. And we appreciate all your inputs, and we look forward to further collaboration on the various social media on this. Thank you very much.